Hey folks, that's probably the most famous melody ever created for cello. I think all the great cello players have a go at that. That's Les Saints, or the Swan, from Saint-Saëns' Carnaval des Animaux, Carnival of the Animals. And I did a video that was well received about my favorite guitar players, and although this won't be as popular, I feel that because my first instrument was cello, that I should do one, even though many of you will click off thinking, oh, it's just cello, we don't care about cellists. Stick around though, it's interesting stuff, and you get some good tips on cellists to look out for. In this video I'm a bit more prepared than on the last one, where I just sort of waffled and then had to add people that I'd missed in text on the actual video. I actually made a list, so let me talk about some of these cellists. Of course, the father of modern cello is Pablo or Pau Casals, who is an absolute magician on the instrument and revolutionized fingering and bowing techniques. However, a lot of the recordings that survived since he was famous in the 40s, 50s, 60s are not great recordings. So you can hear him play, you can actually discern his ability, but they're not the best recordings. Of course, Yo-Yo Ma is an absolute giant. He's the one that comes out of everybody's mouth when talking about cello. He doesn't make my top 5 though, I'm telling you. He's a absolutely brilliant cellist. His enthusiasm for the instrument and what he's done for the solo repertoire is second to none. He also does a lot of world music with his ensemble, which I really like as well, combining tribal and third world instruments, lesser known instruments, with Western orchestral instruments. Saw him play live with Vladimir Ashkenazy, and it was a great concert. Don't get me wrong, he's a great cellist. Slava Rostropovich is somebody you should be aware of, the great Russian cellist. I think I have him doing the Dvorak cello concerto on vinyl. Really laid back, had a long end pin, just sort of changed the look of the cello on stage. Brilliant player. You can get a lot of his recordings, which are absolutely top notch. The first famous cello I became aware of was Jacqueline Dupre, the great English cellist, who made her name for her Elgar, her version of Elgar cello concerto, which is a very romantic and melodic piece and perfect for her style. I have the VHS recording of the famous concert that she did with, I think, the young Daniel Barenboim, and they were an item at that particular time, and it's just fantastic. She really communicates with the duende, or the soul of the instrument, in that particular piece. It's what she's famous for. She's good at the romantic stuff, not so good at Baroque or Bach, or even early classical. The great Misha Mayarsky came on the scene with his Bach cello suites, playing them 100 miles an hour quicker than anyone else. When he was young, that was a famous recording. He's done everything. He's the cellist with the flaming silver hair that goes well, one of two, because of course Stephen Isserlis has flaming silver hair as well. And he's done some, he's redone the cello concerto, the cello suites in his older age, and it's a much more measured and less impetuous performance, but he's a wonderful cellist. My favorite cellist at the moment doesn't make most people's lists. He's the Italian maestro Giovanni Sollima. And he is adept at playing the classical repertoire, but he also writes most of his own music and does a lot of sort of modern, some stuff sort of from the minimalist school, but also very contemporary, tuneful stuff. So he's not really, sort of one of the modernist avant-gardists, atonal types. Definitely some melodies in his music, but he's an absolute gymnast on the cello. And go watch. He's got loads of YouTube videos. Go check out Giovanni Sollima. He will mesmerize you with what he can do. He does a lot of tricks. And Yo-Yo Ma, actually, when he played with him, I think in New York, said that Solima was the greatest cellist alive at the moment, which is a tribute. Going back in time, there are three great cellists that sort of preceded the Yo-Yo Ma era. Emmanuel Fourierman, Pierre Fournier, and Paul Tortelier are fantastic German and French cellists that were big in the 70s, 60s, 70s, early 80s. My old teacher in London was a student of Pierre Fournier and Paul Tortelier, so I have a direct connection to those cellists, and I've got some recordings by both of them. Anna Bilsma is also a great cellist. Daniel Shafran, the great Russian cellist. Not a lot of recordings survive of his, but he's an absolutely amazing and underrated cellist that has some really classic recordings of the classical repertoire. A bit under the radar, we've got Peter Wispelsey, great Dutch cellist. Sol Gabetta, who is a contemporary female cellist. The queen of cello, however, is Natalia Gutman, who did a lot of recordings in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, and is just a fantastic, doesn't look like a cello player, doesn't look like she has the physique for a cello player, including her hands, but just an absolute maestro on the cello. Natalie Klein has come along also and staked a claim for women cellists. I had a chance to see the great Danish cellist Truls Mork play when I lived in Cincinnati, and I was working at the one of the local violin shops. Got to go to a concert. We worked on his bow, I think the day before. That guy can play anything. Truls Mork is a really fantastic cellist and should be a lot more popular. Ralph Kirschbaum, Leonard Rose, these are great names from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Leonard Rose was actually one of the teachers of Jacqueline Dupre. Fantastic cellist, doesn't get his due, but has done some wonderful recordings. As a cellist, if you don't know this, the holy grail are the 6 Bach suites for solo cello. All the great cellists have a go at those, and there are loads of versions of them, and they all play them differently. My favorite version is by Janos Starker, who is a Spanish cellist. I think he's gone now, but absolute economy with cello playing. He sort of sits like this and never moves, doesn't sway like yo-yo, and his fingers fly, and his bowing hand is just absolutely mesmerizing. A wonderful cellist. Janos Starker plays a lot of the repertoire, but I particularly like the way he does Bach. He doesn't romanticize Bach. He plays it in the very terse Baroque style, with lots of quick, short, détaché bowing instead of sort of making it into a romantic piece, if you like. The great English cellist Stephen Isserlis, I've mentioned, also wonderful. Alison Wallerstein has come along in the last few years, also a great cellist. I saw Lynn Harrell play in San Diego many, many years ago. Very underrated cellist, has lots of recordings, can play, across the repertoire. Really, really good cellist. Julian Lloyd Webber, who's the brother of Andrew Lloyd Webber, the musical writer, is not as well known as he should be. He was a very, very accomplished cellist, really good at doing sort of greatest hits cello tunes type albums, so he could play the Swan, he could play the Bore from the first cello suite. He has a really sweet tone, so really good at the romantic stuff. One of my favorite string quartets is the Kronos Quartet, who you may have heard of. They do a lot of modern music, so very angular, atonal, experimental type stuff, and the cellist from that group for most of its tenure is Jean Jeanneroux, and I don't think she gets enough credit. I think just an absolutely fantastic cellist for Kronos Quartet. Has done some solo stuff recently. The great Heinrich Schiff, who we lost recently, great cellist, really quick, just incredibly lightning fast the way he plays. And more recently, one I haven't looked into as much, but I'm starting he's starting to get my attention, is Gautier Capuchon. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but he's really making waves as sort of the new kid on the block. Really fantastic cellist from what I've heard, and well deserving of the being the new virtuoso on the scene. I don't just listen to classical cello or traditional cello repertoire. I like all kinds of cello stuff. So let me just talk about a few of the alternative or new directions cellists, as they call them, over the years. Of course, the most well-known is two cellos, which is Stepjan Hauser and Lukas Sulic. And when they started doing sort of like cello versions of, Purple Haze and Led Zeppelin tunes, and their hair's flying everywhere and their bowstrings hanging off, and I thought it was a bit gimmicky, but I've since looked into both those cellists. They actually play a lot of the classical repertoire, and they're both brilliant cello players. They really are. So yeah, they're a bit gimmicky. They do very sort of populist type music when they do the two cello stuff. But they've also done premieres of modern or living composers, including Sollima, Solima's cello works. So I like their more serious stuff, actually. Of course, the pop and rock stuff gets people interested in the cello, so it's important. But I actually like it when they play more serious cello music, because I think they're both that good. I mean, there's nothing to choose between them. They're both excellent. I think one of them did I think it was Sulic did a great version of the Foire cello, and Hauser, I think, has done Vivaldi and some other stuff. So excellent. If you want cello punk, there's a great band called Rasputina. Rasputina are 5 female cellists, and they put fuzz and electronics on the cello, and they make a racket. It's great stuff. They have a lot of albums. They've been around a long time, so check them out. Rasputina. Apocalyptica is sort of a little bit too populist for me. I appreciate their talent. I appreciate what they do. They got famous doing stuff like Nothing Else Matters from Metallica. So they do sort of metal tunes on the cello and convert that whole vibe over to cellos, which is important. It gets people interested, it gets kids interested, but for me it's a bit gimmicky. Another one from that sort of vibe is Stephen Sharp Nelson, who plays with a group called the Piano Guys. I don't know why they call themselves the Piano Guys, because the cello stuff in that group is almost on the level of two cellos. He's an excellent player. So they do a lot of videos on YouTube, a lot of sort of tricky, fun, comical stuff with the cello and other instruments as well. Jazz cellists, I really like. Ron Carter is a famous double bass player from way back. He's played with all the greats, including, I think, Coltrane and Miles. And on some of his solo albums, he plays the cello, and sort of, it's not technically clean. He's not. You can tell he's not a cellist. He's a double bass player playing the cello. But I really like what he does with the cello. So Ron Carter sort of brought the cello into jazz music and made a splash. Similarly, there's a cellist called David Darling who started out doing jazz and has a lot of jazz recordings. Became known for his ECM recordings, which are very ambient, atmospheric. So he became sort of the father of ambient cello, and his stuff is lush, beautiful, very spiritual, very meditative, if you like that kind of stuff. So I'd recommend him. Von Cello is another one who does sort of brings modern music into cello, plays a lot of electric cellos, and sort of mixes up the genres a little bit. Don't know too much about him, but I've seen a couple of YouTube videos, and it's fun stuff. Eugene Frisson also does jazz stuff, moving jazz elements into cello, playing like 4-part jazz pieces on cellos. Really good technical cellist as well. And then you have your experimental electric loop cellists. The most well known is Zoe Keating, who has a few albums out now, and she kind of does what I do with the cello, but much better, much more professional, of course. She blends all different cello styles with different loopers and makes just interesting experimental pieces. A really interesting cellist if you are into more experimental sort of vibe. Although a lot of it's very melodic as well. It's very pleasant. It's not all just making a racket. I think she crafts her pieces really well. In that vein is also Julia Kent, another British cellist who does the same sort of thing. Slightly different flavor than Zoe, but really the sort of same thing with looping and creating cello textures. Another cellist who doesn't get enough attention, in my view, is a cellist called Adam Hurst, who mixes sort of Eastern style, Arabic style music, as well as other sort of world music flavors in with his cello playing. Very technically good cellist, not overwrought, doesn't have really romantic vibrato. He's just a very precise, clean, great left hand in terms of fingering, all that. Very clean for playing sort of Arabic scales and stuff like that. You really need to have good intonation and be very precise in your fingering, and he does really well with that. I've listened he's got lots of stuff on YouTube. Check him out, Adam Hurst, another great cellist. So there you go, that runs the gamut, and I'm sure I've left a lot of people out. I just wrote this list off the top of my head. But there's loads of stuff in the world of cello. It's not just ELO, but cello is becoming very active in rock groups. You start seeing cellists show up in all kinds of rock, jazz, new wave, punk, all kinds of ensembles. Years ago, my friend Greg Dooley had a cello player for his Afghan Wigs live shows, and it worked really well. And I see it quite often. I often see a band with a cello player on stage. Sometimes they're doing sort of drones or background, sort of mimicking a keyboard function, but other times they're playing more melodic lines or doing something a little bit more dynamic. So I think there's a lot more to explore. I put my own little cello album out on my Bandcamp page, which I post. The link is always posted on my video text. The album is called Lone Wolf Tone. It's kind of an inside joke because a wolf tone is actually a bad note on a cello. So I'm playing around with an inside joke there. But it's kind of akin to, there are some, sort of more typical cello sounds, but also a lot of very modern textural stuff as well, sort of like Zoe Keating and Julia Kent. Bit of David Darling influence as well. If you feel like checking it out, you can listen to any Bandcamp album 3 times before you for free. So you can go listen to it. I think it's $5 to download it, so it's fairly cheap. But anyway, that's a video on cello. I know this won't be as popular, but I think it's important to treat it the same way and talk about all the virtuosos and great, wonderful players from past and present, and so many innovators and dynamic sound magicians that are using this instrument for many different effects and textures. So, all right, folks, see you next time.